Welcome to Connecting the Dots with Bishop Robin Michael Beach, a nexus of profound theological insight and actionable leadership, spiritually and civically. From the arena of civic duty and government to the global mission field, we bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and 21st century reality. I am a spiritual architect, a scholar, and for these few moments, I will be your guide to a faith that is limitless. Now, let's begin the conversation. Let's connect the dots. I want to say something today that is going to make some of you uncomfortable. And I want you to sit with that discomfort. Because discomfort is often the first sign that something true is trying to get through. Deconstruction is not the enemy of faith. Now say it again with me. Deconstruction is not the enemy of faith. Deconstruction is the prerequisite for a faith that can actually survive the 21st century. Now, I know what some of you were taught. I know the word deconstruction has been weaponized in certain church circles, used as a synonym for apostasy, for rebellion, for walking away from God. I have sat across from pastors who treat the word like a contagion. I have watched institutions respond to questioning believers with suspicion, with shame, and with ultimatums. And in doing so, in making certainty the price of admission, those institutions have driven away an entire generation of people who were taking the claims of the kingdom seriously enough to interrogate them. Now think about that for a moment. We have penalized the very people who cared enough to ask hard questions. The 21 to 45 generation, and I am talking about a global demographic, not just the American church, is pulling apart everything. Politics, economics, gender roles, race, power, and yes, religion. They are not doing this because they are lazy or rebellious or spiritually bankrupt. They are doing this because the systems they have inherited have failed to deliver their promises. And when a system fails to deliver, honest people ask why. What we are witnessing is not a rebellion against God. It is a rebellion against the containment strategies built around the name of God. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Today on Connecting the Dots, we're going to look at the architecture of deconstruction, what it actually is, where it comes from theologically, why Jesus himself was the ultimate deconstructionist, and most importantly, how to navigate this process without losing your soul in the rubble. Because here's the thing nobody is telling you. Deconstruction done right is not the end of faith. It is the beginning of a faith worth having. So let's go. To understand why deconstruction is happening at the scale we are seeing it, you have to understand what this generation was handed. The generation in their 20s, 30s, and early 40s was raised in an era of profound institutional certainty. And I want you to understand what I mean by that. I am not talking about personal conviction or deep faith. I am talking about a particular kind of package, systematized, pre-assembled theology that was handed to people like a product, complete, sealed, and non-returnable. The message was clear. If you pray this prayer, God will bless you. If you vote this way, you're protecting the nation. If you attend this church, tithe this amount, follow these rules, you will be safe. You will be approved. You will belong. It was a transactional theology built on the promise of certainty, built on the promise of safety. And for a while, for many people, it worked. Or at least it appeared to work. But then they grew up. They grew up and saw the hypocrisy of religious leaders who preached sexual purity while covering up profound abuse. They saw institutions that protected their own reputation at the expense of the vulnerable people in their care. They saw a theology that promised blessing to the faithful and then watched faithful people suffer catastrophically while the institution offered them guilt instead of comfort. They watched leaders who preached humility build personal empires. They watched churches that preached love become the most hostile environments in their communities. And the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. And here's what I need you to understand about cognitive dissonance. Because this is where the psychology intersects with the theology. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological stress that occurs when your lived experience directly contradicts the belief system you hold. And when that gap becomes too wide, the human mind cannot sustain it. Something has to give. And there you have two options when your lived experience contradicts your theological system. Option one, you can simply deny your reality. You gaslight yourself. You tell yourself that what you experienced did not mean what you know that it meant. You perform certainty while privately drowning in doubt. And I want to tell you, I've sat with enough people in counseling rooms to know that this path leads to profound psychological and spiritual damage. Option two, you dismantle the system. You start asking questions, you pull at the threads, you examine the architecture of what you were handed, and you ask, is this actually true? Is this actually God, or is this a human construction that has been placed over God to manage and control access to him? That is deconstruction, and it is not rebellion. It is intellectual and spiritual honesty. Now, here's where the institutional church has compounded the problem. Because the institutional church, by and large, has condemned this process. It has treated questioning as disloyalty. It has made doubt a sin. And in doing so, it has left an entire generation to navigate this process completely alone, without guides, without frameworks, without a theological tradition that validates what they are experiencing. We have created a culture where certainty is the price of admission. And in doing so, we have driven away the very people who were taking the claims of the kingdom seriously enough to interrogate them. Now, let me say that one more time, because I really need you to hear it. We have driven away the very people who were taking the claims of the kingdom seriously enough to interrogate them. That is not a win for the church. That is a catastrophic failure of pastoral leadership. And it is a failure we need to own before we can address it. Now, let's go to the text. Because if you're going to understand deconstruction theologically, you have to understand that it is not a modern secular invention. It is not something that originated in a French philosophy department in the 1960s and infected the church from the outside. Deconstruction is a deeply prophetic tradition. It is woven into the very fabric of the biblical narrative. Open your understanding to the Hebrew prophets for a moment. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, what were they doing? They were deconstructing. They were standing inside the religious systems of Israel and tearing apart the assumptions, the dangerous, deadly assumptions that religious observance equals divine approval. Listen closely to Amos 5:21 through 24. God is speaking directly. He says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Do you understand what is happening in that text? God is not condemning worship. God is condemning the weaponization of worship, the use of religious practice as a substitute for genuine transformation. The people of Israel had built an entire religious architecture, festivals, sacrifices, strong songs, ceremonies, and they were using that architecture to avoid the actual demands of the covenant. They were performing religion while practicing injustice. God's response? Tear it down. That is deconstruction. That is the prophetic tradition. And it did not begin with Jacques Derrida. It began with the Spirit of God moving through human voices to dismantle the human additions that had obscured the true nature of the divine. But if you want the most powerful example of theological deconstruction in all of Scripture, you do not go to the prophets, you go to what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, the most concentrated, most radical, most world-altering piece of theological teaching in human history. And at the center of it is a structure that Jesus uses 6 times. 6 times. A deliberate, rhythmic architectural pattern. You have heard it said, but I tell you. 6 times, he takes the established theological framework of his day, the interpretive tradition that had been built up around the Torah by generations of religious scholars, and he absolutely pulls it apart. Not to destroy it, not to dismiss it, but to expose what had been buried underneath it. You have heard that it was said, do not murder. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus is not lowering the standard. He is revealing that the religious establishment had been managing behavior at the surface level while leaving the interior architecture of the human heart completely untouched. They had built a system of external compliance that required nothing of the soul. And Jesus came to tear that system down. Not because he was against the law, but because he was for the human beings the law was meant to liberate. The religious leaders accused him of destroying the law. Matthew 5:17, Jesus anticipates the accusation directly. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, the Greek word there for fulfill is plero, and this word is critical. Let me talk about this for a moment for you. The Hebrew term, Greek term, plero, it means to fill, full, to bring to completion, to give the full intended meaning. Once again, the reference, Matthew 5:17, I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill, to bring to completion, to complete its intended meaning. Jesus was not destroying the law. He was removing the human additions, the oppressive interpretive layers, the religious bureaucracy that had been built on top of it, and revealing the original liberating intent underneath. Now that is the theological mandate for deconstruction. Not to destroy, to fulfill. To clear away the human constructions that have obscured the true nature of God, so that the original, liberating, transformative reality can be seen clearly. Now, I want to say something that I need you to write down, or screenshot, or tattoo on the inside of your eyelids, whatever works for you. If your theology cannot survive being questioned, it is not a theology, it is an ideology. Theology that is genuine, robust, kingdom theology is not afraid of questions. It is not threatened by doubt. It does not require the suppression of intellectual honesty to remain standing, because the kingdom is built on truth, and truth, by its very nature, is never afraid of the light. The systems that collapse under questioning were never built on truth to begin with. They were built on authority, on compliance, on the social pressure of belonging. And when the pressure is removed, when someone finally asks, but is this actually true? Those systems have nothing left to stand on. See, that is not a failure of faith. That is a failure of the system. And the person walking away from the rubble is not an apostate. They are a truth seeker. And the kingdom has always had room for truth seekers. Now, let's get to the part that nobody wants to talk about, because it's easier to talk about tearing down than it is to talk about building up. Deconstruction is, in many ways, the easier half of the work, because tearing down feels like freedom. It feels like release. Every big brick you remove from the wall is a weight that you no longer have to carry. But here's what I need you to hear and understand today. And I'm saying this with all the pastoral care and theological precision that I can bring to bear. The danger of deconstruction is not that you start asking questions. The danger is that you stop. There is a subculture that has emerged, and I see it across social media, in podcasts, and books, that glories in the tearing down, that has built entire platforms, entire identities, entire communities around what they no longer believe. And I understand it, I genuinely do. But when you have been hurt by a religious system, when you have been shamed and controlled and manipulated in the name of God, the act of naming that, of saying this was wrong, of refusing to pretend anymore, that is healing. That is necessary. But you cannot live in the rubble. You cannot build a life on a foundation of negation. You cannot build a community around what you are against. You cannot raise children, love a spouse, serve your neighbor, or contribute to the healing of the world on the fuel of deconstruction alone. And here is the deeper problem. If your spiritual identity is defined by what you are against, if the system you left still occupies the center of your theological universe, even as the thing you are rejecting, then you are still being controlled by the system you left. You have not achieved freedom, you have simply achieved a different form of captivity. Real freedom is not the absence of the old system. Real freedom is the presence of something that is true. Deconstruction must eventually lead to reconstruction. The goal of tearing down the false idol is not to stand in an empty field. The goal is to clear the ground so you can build an altar to the living God. Now, what does that reconstruction look like? I want to give you 3 markers, 3 signs that your deconstruction is moving in the right direction. The first marker is honesty. Reconstruction begins with the willingness to be honest about what you actually believe, not what you are supposed to believe, not what your community expects you to believe, not what would make you socially acceptable in your current context. What you actually, genuinely, in the quiet of your own soul, believe to be true about God, about humanity, and about the nature of reality? What is it that you actually genuinely believe? See, this kind of honesty is terrifying because it requires you to sit with uncertainty. And we have been trained to treat uncertainty as a spiritual failure. But I want to suggest to you that uncertainty held honestly is one of the most spiritually mature postures a human being can occupy. It is the posture of someone who is taking truth seriously enough to refuse to pretend. Now, the second marker is humility. Reconstruction requires the recognition that you do not have to figure everything out. And you definitely don't have to do it alone. One of the great ironies of deconstruction is that it often produces a new kind of arrogance. The certainty that the system was wrong, that the people in it are blind, and that you have seen what they cannot see. And while there may be bits of truth in that assessment, arrogance will not build anything worth living in. Humility means you are willing to learn. It means you are willing to sit with people who see things differently than you do. It means you are willing to hold your current conclusions loosely, not because truth does not matter, but because you are still in the process of finding it. Now, the third marker, and this one is extremely important, is community. This is the one that people in deconstruction most often resist, and I understand why. Community is where they got hurt. Community is where the system was enforced. Community is where the shame lived. But I want to tell you something that the sociology of human flourishing makes absolutely clear. You cannot reconstruct alone. Human beings are not designed for isolated spiritual development. We are formed in relationship. We are shaped by community. The question is not whether you will be shaped by a community. The question is, which community will do the shaping? See, the answer is not to return to the system that wounded you. The answer is to find or build a grounded community. A community that is willing to ask the terrifying questions together. A community that does not require you to perform certainty in order to belong. A community that is committed to the hard, slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding. Not on the foundation of institutional authority, but on the foundation of truth, love, and the relentless pursuit of the living God. To be grounded, and this is the word I want to leave with you today, to be grounded means you are willing to ask the terrifying questions, but it also means you are willing to do the hard work of rebuilding. It means you are willing to move from the safety of certainty, which was never actually safe, into the vulnerability of faith, which is the only place where genuine encounter with the living God has ever actually happened. Abraham left everything he knew and went to a place he had never seen, not because he had certainty, but because he had a direction. The disciples left their nets, not because they had a 5-year plan, but because something in the voice of Jesus told them that following was worth more than staying. The woman at the tomb did not go to celebrate a resurrection they were certain of. They went in grief, in confusion, in the wreckage of everything they thought they understood. And they were the first ones to encounter the risen Christ. See, the kingdom has always been found in the rubble, not by people who stayed in the rubble, but by people who were willing to pick up a stone and start building. That is the invitation today. Not to stop asking questions, not to return to the system that failed you, but to refuse to let the deconstruction be your final destination. Clear the ground, build the altar, do the hard, holy work of reconstruction. Because the world does not need more people who are good at tearing things down. The world is full of those. The world needs architects. The world needs builders. The world needs people who have been through the fire of deconstruction and come out the other side with something true in their hands. That is who the kingdom is looking for. And I genuinely believe, that is who is listening to this podcast today. Before I let you go today, I want to leave you with this. You cannot live in the rubble. The goal of tearing down the faults is not deconstruction. It is preparation. You tear down the false idol to clear the ground for the true. You dismantle the containment strategy so you can encounter the God who was never contained. Deconstruction is not your destination. It is your doorway. Walk through it. This has been Connecting the Dots. I am Bishop Robin Michael Beach. If this episode challenged you, encouraged you, or gave you language for something you have been carrying, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a review. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are in a season deconstructing right now, if you are sitting in the rubble and you are not sure what comes next, reach out. You do not have to navigate this alone. The community of BridgeWay Global Fellowship exists for exactly this reason. We'll see you next time on Connecting the Dots, where ancient wisdom is unleashed for modern liberation. So today, my friends, stay grounded. You've been listening to Connecting the Dots with Bishop Robin Michael Beach. It is our sincere hope that today's insights have equipped you to lead with depth and live with clarity. To continue the journey and access more resources, look for me online at Robin Michael Beach Unlimited or follow my work with BridgeWay Global across all platforms. Remember, the dots are waiting to be connected. Ancient wisdom is yours for today's challenges. Until next time, stay provocative, stay authentic, and stay empowered. This has been a production of Robin Michael Beach Unlimited.